Hello, everybody. Welcome to Speakeasy. I'm very happy you decided to tune in this week because we've got some very cool stuff to go over. Let's jump right on in. So there's really two time periods that have an effect on the Dagger of Amon-Ra. The characters and the setting are obviously 1920s New York, with all that goes along with that. There's a lot of fashion, a lot of glamour, and a lot of excitement, but there's also near desperate money problems, crime, greed, and just a whole lot of fun rot eating away below the gilded surface. 1920s New York is a really exciting time and place, and it's definitely going to be worth a look in one or more future speakeasies. However, for this week, I thought it would be cool to take a closer look at one aspect of the other time and place influencing the Dagger of Amon-Ra, ancient Egypt. One of the really interesting contrasts in this game to me is the clash between modern and traditional worlds. Dr. Carter, a very modern person, values self-promotion, money, fame, things like that. Dr. Smith, and probably Ramses Najir a little bit, are more traditional-minded people, and they value things like tradition and culture and religion. They especially seem to value Egyptian religion. Both of them seem to be very interested in Egypt, Egyptology, and the Egyptian religion. So that led me to wonder, and to want to share with all of you, what exactly is Egyptian religion? What is their religious tradition like? What do they believe? So I thought this week we will take a little look at Egyptian religion, ancient Egyptian religion. Now, of course, before we go into this, there's a few caveats that I have to add, as there would be with any major review of something as complex as this. There is no one central religion believed by everyone in Egypt all the time. Egypt is a millennia-long people group and kingdom, and so obviously things are going to change in that. Not only that, but before the unification of the upper and lower kingdoms of Egypt, and even before the unification of those kingdoms, there were countless city town folk religions going along, so what we think of as Egyptian religion is probably just the conglomeration of all those over a period of thousands of years. Additionally, we have to consider that even though Egypt is a dry country, and so we have an unusually high number of records and pieces of papyrus and parchment saved, there still is nothing like a complete record. What we have are scraps of papyrus, many hundreds of scraps of papyrus with short snatches of Egyptian religion on them, as well as the hieroglyphics that were carved into the tombs of the pharaohs. Now, obviously this is going to predispose us towards a certain interpretation of the religion, and that is sort of the official, the state-sponsored version. Scribes would be the ones who would be able to read, and they would be under the authority of and under the employ of the pharaoh, and obviously anything that gets carved into the very tombs of the pharaoh is going to be ruler-friendly, pharaoh-friendly religion. So it could be that there was some folk religion which portrayed human rulers in a more negative light. We're only seeing the ones which portray the pharaoh as being very central and very powerful because we're essentially seeing his version. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm going to present the story a certain way, which is consistent in many regards with a lot of the other stories. However, you will be able to find, if you do even a little bit of looking, different ways the story is told with a few different characters and things like that. Nonetheless, this is going to be a relatively consistent picture of the major themes of Egyptian religion. So here we go. Incidentally, part of the thanks for this speakeasy goes to Dr. Bonnie Irwin, whose talk about Egyptian myths was extremely enlightening and definitely worth checking out. If you want to look it up, it's actually on YouTube, called Myths About Ancient Egyptian Myths. In the beginning, there was nothing except for a chaotic watery void called Nu. It's interesting, but for whatever reason, in many cultures and folklore around the world, the beginning, before there was any creation, tends to be this formless, watery void. You can see this even in the book of Genesis. In the beginning it says, "There was nothing, the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters." You can see this in Aztec mythology, where before any of the dual gods were created, there was sort of this watery nothingness. It's the same in Chinese mythology, where they say that the earth and the sky were all rolled up into one, and it was just sort of, it was again this watery, chaotic nothingness. Now, sometimes this nothingness, as in Chinese mythology, is identified as being essentially amoral. It's just there. That's the case in Norse mythology, too, although it's interesting. In Norse mythology, it's ice instead of water, which I guess is appropriate because of how far north it is. But in Egyptian mythology, as well as the cosmology of the ancient Hebrews, this watery nothingness, this anti-creation, is in some way identified as being evil, as being the enemy. Just as a little side note, that's one of the notes about the book of Jonah, in which a Hebrew prophet throws himself into the sea to try to escape from God. The Hebrew conception is the farthest place you could get from God would be in the bottom of the ocean, because it was sort of, returning yourself to this primeval chaos against which God is seen as a creator. Well, just so in Egyptian mythology, the void, the watery nothingness, new is not good. So, from this watery nothingness, the creator god thinks himself into existence. Now, this creator god can have a number of different names. It actually depends on where you are. The three major cities in Egypt would be Thebes, Heliopolis, which is now called Cairo, or Memphis. If you were in Thebes, the creator god would be called Amun, or Amun-Ra. Heliopolis, it would be Atun, or Atun-Ra, which is obviously pretty much the same thing, and in Memphis it was just called Ta. This creator god thinks himself into existence, thinks or wills himself into existence, so he becomes the first thing to sort of pull itself together out of this watery chaos. And then he creates with his hands a mound of land, a place to stand on, because you can't stand in the water. He then lays with his shadow, has congress with his shadow, and makes two sisters. One of them is dominance over Aaron's sunlight, and she was named Shu. The other is rain and moisture, and that is Tefnut. And here's, again, just another neat little thing about Egyptian mythology. Most creation stories have their creators making everything through one of three different methods. They will either think or speak it into being. You can again here think of the Old Testament, where God says, "Let there be light," and there just is light. He doesn't have to physically make it. He thinks it into being. He speaks it. The other way is gods can make things with their hands. They can be good craftsmen in that sense. This features in Aztec mythology, where the first of the dual gods makes the world, crafts it with their hands. And the third is they can exude the world through some sort of bodily process. As an example, one of the African myths has the creator god floating in the primeval void, because it's, again, water. And then one day they get a stomach ache, and so they vomit up the world. They regurgitate it. Sometimes in Norse mythology, for instance, people are sweated out. And honestly, it just gets grosser from there, so, use your imagination. What's neat about that is Egyptian mythology, as you can see, actually uses all three in one creation myth. You have the creator thinking himself into being, crafting the world with his hands, and then having congress with his shadow, and so creating the first of the other gods through sex, basically. There's another exuding bodily process story, which is, this may be one of my favorite stories for the creation of humans, which is obviously an important part of most myths, and it goes something like this. The first god, we'll call it just Amon-Ra, because that's, most similar to the game, had a mystical eye. One of his eyes could leave his face and travel around everywhere and sort of see things and come back to him. You could think of that sort of like the ravens that served Odin in Norse mythology. They were just sort of his eyes, although in this case, literally his eye. Anyway, that eye went out, presumably into Nu somewhere, just looking at things. Although I guess there probably wouldn't be much to see in Nu, but regardless, it was out and about looking at things. And his daughters, that would be Shu and Tefnut, thought, man, that eye's been gone for a really long time. Our father's probably going to want it back. So they didn't tell him, and they just left to go find the eye. Well, he is a creator god, so he was like, man, my eye's been gone for a long time. I'll just make another one, because I can just make whatever, because I'm a creator god. So he makes an eye. His sisters then find the old eye, and they come back with it. And the old eye sees the new eye, and realizes it has no place in the creator's face anymore, and it's enraged by this, and it cries these hot, angry tears, and people actually come out of the tears. So, according to ancient Egyptian mythology, that's sort of our place in the grand scheme of things. We are the bitter tears of a hobo eye. Now, around this time, you will also see the emergence, some texts don't really say from where, of a sun god who is commonly called Ra. Ra would later go on to be identified with the creator, having this sort of composite creator-sun god. So that's where the creator would be Amun or Atun, and the sun god would be Ra. So that's where we get Amon-Ra or Atun-Ra. I'm not really sure what's going on in Memphis, where they just call him Ta, but it's sort of the same thing there too. Anyway, so we've got the creator, and we've got the two sisters, which are his two children. At this point in time, the sun god tends to be threatened by chaos, by the primeval forces of Nu. Sometimes he loses an eye, sometimes he loses his daughter, he loses something. And this is where stories have his eye going out into Nu. Sometimes that's how he loses it, sometimes he loses a daughter that the eye goes out to find. Anyway, eye goes out to find it, and then he makes people. So those are the tiers. The creator god Amun-Ra and his two sisters will then make Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And those are two lovers. They are united and they are together. And this sort of harkens back to the Chinese tradition where earth and sky were sort of together in the beginning. And they were said to quarrel incessantly. And so they are separated by Amun-Ra. And that's where we get the separation of earth and sky. Now, while he's continued to be venerated, Amun-Ra sort of takes a lesser importance or lesser role in things from this point on. The regular pantheon of the gods are created by Geb and Nut. Anyway, the four important gods that they created this time are Osiris and his wife Isis, and Seth and his wife Nephthys. So this is what's called the Ennead, which literally means a group of 9. In Greek, Ennead means a group of 9. You have Amun-Ra, the creator god. You have the two sisters, who are his children, that is, Shu, who is air and sunlight, and Tefnut, who is rain and moisture. You then have Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky, another couple made by Amun-Ra and his sisters. They were themselves a couple, and they made the rest of the pantheon, which is Seth and Nephthys, his wife, and Osiris and Isis, his wife. These 9 are sort of the core of the Egyptian pantheon, and they are worshipped more than any other gods. There are a variety of other gods besides this, but they tend to be for more specific places, more specific towns. Every town would have its god. Sometimes every family would have their god. This was also practiced in Greece as well. But there was absolutely this core 9 gods. Of those, Amun-Ra was not the most active, but he was still definitely venerated. And there was a very interesting concept, which is very central to Egyptian mythology and religion, which is the concept of Mat. And Mat could be defined as rightness, order, law, things like that. The creator god, Amun-Ra, was seen as imposing this kind of order. Think of him forming solid land out of the featureless Nun, or the watery void. Mat was involved with right actions, right thought, right thinking, and it was the duty of the pharaoh, who was considered to be a god on earth, to bring Mat to the kingdom, to bring order to things. Some people think that this was because of the regular flooding of the Nile every year, that they saw this regular pattern, this regular order. Whereas other places, for instance, if you live near the Tigris or Euphrates, those were much less reliable. Some years they would be almost out, some years they would be flooding everywhere. So it's easy to see that the Egyptians would see their particular kingdom as being one that was ordered correctly. And a lot of the religious mythology focuses on, as people might know, death in some sense. The Egyptians were very focused on the concept of preparing themselves for death, which is sort of interesting because it's not like they saw death as the end and they worshipped death. The idea was, if you went to the kingdom of the dead and you had lived according to Mat, according to the dictates of the pharaoh of the time, and according to dictates of the gods said, when you got to the kingdom of the dead, you would be able to make what were called the declarations of the righteous man. And they were just a series of things you had not done. You hadn't murdered people, you hadn't not offered hospitality, things like that. Your heart would be considered to be light, not very dense, and it would be weighed against a feather by the god of the dead. And if it was found to be light, if you were found to be living in accordance with Mat, you would be let in, and you would live there for a while. And there was a sense later in the future that there would be sort of this renewal, sort of this rebirth. So it wasn't as though the Egyptians were just centered around death. They were centered around entering death correctly so that you could take place in this rebirth. Interestingly, if you did not live according to Mat, then your heart would be hard and heavy, and it would weigh more than the feather, and a crocodile would eat it. So yeah, rebirth was a strong theme. They didn't necessarily believe in a reincarnation to this Earth. They just believed that they would go on adventures and continue to grow and continue to change and perfect themselves in the higher realms, the realms of the gods. And they reflected this in their religion. One interesting thing is graveyards for poor people and pyramids, I guess, for rulers, would be built on the western bank of the Nile, which is where the sun sets. You can think of that in terms of death. But temples were built on the eastern bank of the Nile, where the sun rises, indicating this sort of rebirth, the rebirth that one would find in religion. The other interesting thing about Egyptian religion is somewhat unlike the Greek conception, where gods sort of were their portfolios. Hades was, in a certain sense, the ruler of the realm of the dead, but was identified very, very strongly with it. Egyptian gods tended to be sort of broader than their portfolios. They were the rulers of various things, but just by virtue of being sort of powerful beings. I mean, Amun-Ra was, in a sense, the creator god, and in a sense, sort of the sun god, but he was had a sort of a larger existence than that. He was very much an independent kind of person. He wasn't just chained to the portfolio he was in. Maybe one counterexample would be Osiris, who was very much identified with being the god of the underworld. And that was because he was originally going to be the ruler of man, of sort of this pharaoh god ruling the world, but his brother Seth, who was a god identified with Nu, with that chaos, with evil, got jealous of him, cut him up into many pieces, and scattered the pieces. His wife Isis, and sometimes in some myths, Seth's own wife would go and look for and find all the different parts of Osiris, put him back together. So that's Isis and Nephthys would find all his pieces, put him back together, but they would miss a part or something and he wouldn't be able to stay alive. And so, not being able to stay alive, he would go to the realm of the dead, where he would rule there, and thus he became very tied to the realm of the dead. Other than that, though, like I said, there were many different gods representing many different people. They would frequently have an animal head representing some sort of quality or characteristic that they were supposed to have. And that, in a nutshell, is the important part of Egyptian religion. You were to venerate the gods because that was part of Mat. You were to venerate the pharaoh, who was supposedly a god in human form, who would then go on to become a larger god when he died. He would become a true god as opposed to sort of this god-man conglomerate while he was on Earth. And the gods themselves were many various gods, and then the Ennead, those important 9. And they were venerated in all different sorts of ways, not with human sacrifices we see elsewhere, but through sacrifices of certain kinds. And the Egyptian people, in contrast to many other religions at this time, had a not very fearful relationship with the god. They were seen as being very friendly with their gods. Like I say, some people think that that's because of the regularity of where they lived, the Nile regularly flooding every year and conditions generally being good for agriculture and things like that. They thought they were the favorite of the gods. So I think we can see in part why Dr. Smith and Ramses Najir would be upset with Dr. Carter for taking the Dagger of Amon-Ra out of the country and using it to promote himself. Dr. Carter was very much not acting in terms of Mat. He was desecrating his ancestors, he was not respecting the gods. He was a person of a very different mind than they're used to dealing with. Now, I'm not saying that the portrayal of Egyptian religion and Egyptian culture necessarily follows perfectly the conception of ancient Egyptian religion, but just keep in mind for the rest of the game that when we're talking about Egyptian religion, this is essentially what we're talking about. Veneration of this core 9, the Ennead, living your life in terms of Mat, and preparing yourself for death and then for the eventual rebirth. These are the very strong tenets. So I just hope that this sort of sheds some light on what Egyptian mythology was really like, the people venerated. I personally find it very fascinating. I think it's interesting to compare different people's conceptions of religion and folklore and things like that. And certainly Egypt has, there's a lot more to Egyptian mythology than just the basics that I've sketched and outlined here, beyond the Ennead and Mat. But that is the very core basics that you would need to understand what somebody who venerated Egyptian religion, like Dr. Smith or possibly Ramses Najir would be coming from, and how different their mindset might be from a thoroughly modern, fame-obsessed archaeologist like Dr. Carter or Dr. Carrington or somebody along those lines. All right, well, thanks for joining me. I'll be doing a character sketch different than this bonus video. I'm just going to keep this for bonus content for now, so that should be coming out soon. Tune in, and I hope to see you guys there.